Concubines in feudal Japan held more power than the wives. I know because I served tea in their chambers. While wives stayed locked away, concubines walked freely through palaces, advised warlords, and controlled entire economies. They weren't mistresses, they were shadow rulers. But here's what nobody tells you. This power came with a price that made slavery look like freedom. Welcome, I'm the historian. Tonight, I will tell you what I saw. This is the story of women who ruled from the shadows while wearing chains of silk. A story that unfolds slowly, like cherry blossoms falling on snow, beautiful and tragic in equal measure. Settle in. There is much to discover. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you find comfort in forgotten stories that reveal hidden truths about the human heart. Let us know where you are watching from, what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights. Close your eyes if you want. Get comfortable. Block out distractions, because tonight, we go deeper than the history books ever dared. I remember standing in the morning mist of Edo, watching a girl of 14 being carried in a palanquin toward the Yoshiwara pleasure quarter. Her name was Yukiko, which meant snow child. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to disappear forever. And that's how it always began. Families sold daughters like rice at the market. Not from cruelty, from hunger. The rice crops had failed 3 seasons running. Children were dying. Parents faced a choice no parent should face. Watch all their children starve, or sell one to save the rest. But here's the thing. These girls weren't sold into slavery. They were sold into something more complex, more beautiful, and infinitely more cruel. They became concubines, which in feudal Japan meant something very different from what you might think. Therefore, Yukiko found herself in a world where she was simultaneously treasure and prisoner, artist and commodity, powerful and powerless all at once. She learned to read poetry, play the shamisen, conduct tea ceremonies with the grace of a temple priestess. She became more educated than most men, more cultured than nobles, more refined than the wives of samurai. And this education wasn't kind. It was an investment. A concubine who could recite classical Chinese poetry while serving sake was worth 50 times more than one who merely looked beautiful. These women became living works of art, human jewels that reflected their owner's sophistication. But education came with invisible chains. Every skill they learned bound them tighter to their fate. The more valuable they became, the less likely they'd ever be free. Like training a songbird to sing so beautifully that you could never bear to open the cage. Therefore, by age 16, Yukiko could compose haiku that would make grown men weep, dance in ways that seemed to defy gravity, and conduct conversation that would shame university scholars. She was magnificent. She was also completely trapped, and the places where they lived were designed to be beautiful prisons. I walked through the Yoshiwara district many times, that walled pleasure quarter in Edo. From the outside, it looked like paradise. Elegant tea houses, perfectly manicured gardens, the sound of shamisen drifting on cherry blossom-scented air. But notice what I said, walled. The entire district was surrounded by walls and a moat. There was only one bridge in or out. Guards checked everyone. The concubines called it the nightless city because lanterns burned all night. But it might as well have been called the city with no exit. Therefore, inside these walls lived nearly 3,000 women who couldn't leave. They lived in houses called greenhouses, not because of their color, but because they were always full of fresh, young life. Like gardens where the flowers never got to see the world beyond the walls. And the hierarchy inside was more complex than the imperial court. At the bottom were the komuro, young girls, 8 or 9 years old, learning the trade. They served the higher-ranking concubines, dressed their hair, cleaned their rooms. and dreamed of one day being important enough to have girls serving them. But above them were the Shinzo, teenagers learning refinement. They practiced calligraphy until their fingers bled, memorized thousands of poems, and learned to move like flowing water. Every gesture had to be perfect. A poorly poured cup of tea could mean a beating. Therefore, the pressure was incredible. These girls lived under constant scrutiny, constant judgment, constant fear of making mistakes. They always smiled, laughed at every joke, and agreed with every opinion. They became human mirrors, reflecting back whatever men wanted to see. And at the top of this pyramid were the Oiran, the highest-ranking courtesans. When I saw one walking through the streets of Yoshiwara, it was like watching a living goddess. She wore a kimono worth more than most people's houses. Her obi was embroidered with real gold thread. Her hair ornaments were family heirlooms from noble houses. But even these queens of the pleasure quarter were prisoners. They just had prettier chains. Their kimonos were so heavy, sometimes 40 pounds or more, that they could barely walk. The elaborate hair ornaments were held in place with pins that pierced their scalps. Beauty was literally painful. Therefore, every element of their appearance was designed to restrict movement. The tiny steps they took weren't graceful by choice. The kimono made normal walking impossible. The pale makeup wasn't just fashion. It was a mask that took hours to apply and couldn't be disturbed by natural expressions. They became living dolls, beautiful and immobile, and their days followed patterns as rigid as monastery schedules. I watched Yukiko's routine through seasons of change, and it never varied. Dawn brought purification rituals, cold water on the face. Incense burned before small shrines, prayers to Benzaiten, the goddess who protected entertainers. But the prayers weren't for happiness or love. They prayed for beauty that wouldn't fade, for voices that wouldn't crack, for hands that wouldn't shake when pouring tea. They prayed to remain valuable, because the moment they lost their worth was the moment they lost everything. Therefore, after prayers came hours of preparation. Hair washing took half the morning. The elaborate styles required specific oils, careful braiding, precise placement of ornaments. The makeup process was like painting a porcelain mask. White powder mixed with water and applied in careful layers. Red lips painted smaller than nature made them. Eyebrows shaved and redrawn in fashionable shapes. And every detail had meaning. The way they painted their teeth black showed their status. Only the highest-ranking concubines darkened their teeth, because it showed they were too refined to bite and tear food like common people. The scent they wore told their specialty: jasmine for dancers, sandalwood for musicians, rose for those skilled in conversation. But the most heartbreaking part was the letter writing. Every concubine spent hours each day writing letters to clients, potential clients, or patrons who might buy their contracts. These letters were works of art, beautiful calligraphy, perfect poetry, emotions crafted to seem spontaneous, but actually calculated to maximum effect. Therefore, they became skilled actors, performing love and desire with technical precision. I read some of these letters over their shoulders. They were masterpieces of manipulation disguised as romance. The cherry blossoms remind me of your kindness. They might write, when they'd never seen the man's kindness, only his money. And the tragic part was that many of them were brilliant. These women, given different circumstances, could have been poets, artists, business leaders. Instead, their intelligence was channeled into elaborate performances of submission and availability. But education came with unexpected power. The most successful concubines became political advisors, cultural influencers, trendsetters. When they whispered suggestions about art, fashion, or even politics, powerful men listened. They wielded influence from the shadows, shaping decisions that affected entire provinces. Therefore, Some concubines accumulated wealth that rivaled merchants. They owned property, invested in businesses, and patronized artists. Within the confined world they inhabited, they built empires of influence and resources. They were simultaneously powerless and incredibly powerful, and the money involved was staggering. I remember watching negotiations for contracts that would make modern business deals look simple. A single night with a high-ranking lawyer could cost more than a farmer's annual income. A yearly contract might be worth more than a small castle. But here's what made it complex. The concubines themselves were both the product and the sales staff. They had to convince men to spend fortunes on their company while pretending the money didn't matter, that they were motivated only by affection or attraction. Therefore, they developed sophisticated techniques of psychological manipulation. They studied their clients like generals study enemy territories. They knew who was lonely, who was arrogant, who needed to feel powerful, who wanted to feel understood. Then they became exactly what each man needed, and the successful ones were essentially running small businesses. They managed their income, invested in their appearance, cultivated relationships with influential patrons, built networks of loyalty among the girls who served them. They were entrepreneurs trapped in a system that treated them as inventory, but the system was designed to keep them trapped through debt. They owed money for their purchase price, their training, their food, their clothing, their room, their makeup, their hair ornaments. Every beautiful thing that made them valuable added to the debt that kept them enslaved. Therefore, most concubines worked their entire lives without ever earning enough to buy their freedom. The more successful they became, the more expensive their lifestyle became, the deeper their debt grew. It was a trap designed by mathematicians. The numbers never worked in their favor, and even those rare women who did earn enough to buy their contracts faced another problem. Where could they go? They were too refined for ordinary work, too famous to disappear into normal society, too associated with the pleasure quarters to be accepted as respectable wives. But some found creative solutions. The smartest ones used their connections to become business owners themselves, opening tea houses or geisha districts in smaller towns. Others became teachers, passing their refinement and skills to the next generation of captive women. Therefore, the system perpetuated itself through the women who had survived it. Those who escaped often became the ones who trained the next group of girls, because it was the only life they knew how to navigate, and the years shaped their lives in ways you wouldn't expect. Spring brought the cherry blossom season, when business boomed as men celebrated hanami, flower viewing parties. The concubines dressed in pale pink and white, like living blossoms, competing with nature for beauty, but spring also brought inspections. Government officials toured the pleasure quarters, checking licenses, examining the women for signs of disease, counting inventory like livestock assessors. The girls stood in lines while men in official robes judged their worth for tax purposes. Therefore, spring was simultaneously their most profitable and most dehumanizing season. They earned the most money while being most explicitly reminded that they were considered property, not people. And summer brought the Obon festival, when the spirits of ancestors returned to Earth. For most Japanese, this was a time of family reunion and remembrance. For the concubines, it was a reminder of the families they'd been sold away from, the ancestors who couldn't find them because they'd been given new names, new identities, but they weren't allowed to mourn openly. Instead, they performed cheerfulness while their hearts broke. They entertained men celebrating family bonds while their own family connections had been severed for money. Therefore, many concubines developed elaborate private rituals during Obon. They wrote letters to dead parents, made offerings to ancestors they couldn't visit, created imaginary reunions in the privacy of their minds. And autumn was the season of poetry competitions. When concubines displayed their literary education, these contests were major social events. Wealthy men bet enormous sums on which courtesan would compose the most beautiful verse about falling leaves or migrating cranes. But the pressure was intense. A poorly composed poem could destroy a reputation that took years to build. I watched women practice for weeks, memorizing classical references, studying the subtle rules of meter and metaphor, and preparing for competitions that would determine their value for the coming year. Therefore, what looked like elegant entertainment was actually a high-stakes performance that could mean the difference between prosperity and poverty, between respect and dismissal, and winter brought the year-end settling of accounts. Contracts were renewed or terminated, debts calculated, futures decided. It was the season when dreams died or were reborn, when some girls learned they'd earned enough to rise in status. Others discovered they'd failed to meet expectations. But winter also brought rare moments of genuine human connection, when business was slow and the walls between performer and person could occasionally drop. Some concubines formed real friendships with each other, found comfort in shared suffering, and created small families of chosen sisters. Therefore, the coldest season often brought the warmest human moments, brief respites from the performance of being perfect, moments when they could simply be tired, scared, hopeful young women supporting each other through impossible circumstances, and they developed skills that went far beyond entertainment. These women became masters of psychology, reading micro-expressions and voice tones like scholars read classical texts. They could assess a man's character, financial situation, and emotional needs within minutes of meeting him. But this wasn't natural talent. It was survival training. A concubine who misread a client's mood could face violence, financial ruin, or worse. They learned to detect dangerous men, manipulative men, generous men, lonely men, and adapt their behavior accordingly. Therefore, they became human chameleons, shifting personalities as smoothly as changing kimono. With one client, they might be submissive and childlike. With another, sophisticated and challenging. With a third, nurturing and maternal. Each relationship required a different performance of femininity, and the physical skills were equally demanding. They trained their bodies like athletes, hours of dance practice, voice training, posture exercises. Their hands had to remain soft despite constant work. Their feet had to stay elegant despite hours of standing. Their faces had to show no signs of stress despite constant pressure. But perhaps most impressive were their memory skills. A successful concubine remembered the preferences, stories, and histories of hundreds of clients. She knew who liked their tea strong, who preferred sad songs, who wanted to discuss poetry, who needed to feel intellectually superior. Therefore, they became living databases of human personality, storing detailed profiles of every man who might pay for their company. This information was power, the ability to make each client feel uniquely understood and valued. And they developed elaborate systems for sharing information. The women who served them, the musicians who played with them, the servants who cleaned their rooms, all became part of intelligence networks that helped each concubine prepare for encounters with specific clients. But they also had to protect each other from dangerous situations. They created subtle warning systems, certain ways of arranging flowers that meant avoid this man, specific songs that signaled distress, coded conversations that shared information about violent clients. Therefore, within the system designed to keep them isolated and competitive, they built hidden networks of mutual support and protection. They found ways to be human even when treated as commodities, and despite the system's attempts to prevent genuine relationships, love sometimes found a way. I witnessed romances between concubines and clients that transcended the business arrangement, connections that survived years and defied the economic logic of the pleasure quarters. But these relationships were dangerous for everyone involved. A concubine who showed genuine preference for one client risked losing others. A client who fell truly in love faced the expensive prospect of competing with other men for attention he thought should be freely given. Therefore, real love had to be conducted in secret, expressed through subtle signals that looked like professional performance to outsiders but carried deeper meaning for those involved. A particular way of folding a letter, a specific flower arrangement, a song chosen for its hidden lyrics. And the most heartbreaking situation was when clients wanted to purchase a concubine's freedom to marry her. It sounds romantic, but the reality was complex. Many women discovered that freedom came with different chains, the expectations of being a perfect wife after years of being a professional entertainer. But some of these relationships did work. The men who truly understood what these women had survived, who respected their intelligence and strength, who saw past the performance to the person, these partnerships sometimes became genuine love stories. Therefore, the pleasure quarters, designed to commodify love, sometimes produced the most authentic connections. People who met when one was literally buying the other's company sometimes found relationships deeper than those formed in conventional society, and the relationships between the women themselves were equally complex. They were competitors for the same clients, the same status, the same opportunities. But they were also the only people who truly understood each other's experiences. But I watched friendships form that were stronger than blood relationships. Women who shared makeup, covered for each other's mistakes, pooled resources to help each other succeed, created chosen families within the artificial world they inhabited. Therefore, in a system designed to isolate them, they found ways to connect. In a world that treated them as objects, they insisted on seeing each other as human beings deserving of loyalty, kindness, and love. And the physical toll was devastating. The makeup they wore daily contained lead, mercury, and other toxic substances that slowly poisoned their skin and organs. The tight clothing restricted breathing and circulation. The elaborate hairstyles pulled so tightly they caused constant headaches and hair loss. But they couldn't complain about pain without risking their value. A concubine who showed signs of illness or discomfort was seen as unprofessional, unreliable. They learned to smile through agony, to appear graceful while their bodies were literally breaking down. Therefore, many developed what we now recognize as chronic health conditions, joint problems from sitting in uncomfortable positions for hours, nerve damage from tight clothing, digestive issues from eating very little to maintain their figures, and the emotional toll was perhaps worse. Living as a constant performance, never being allowed to express genuine emotions, always having to prioritize others' comfort over your own needs. It created psychological damage that lasted lifetimes, but they weren't allowed therapy or emotional support. Instead, they turned to each other, creating informal counseling networks where women shared coping strategies, emotional support, and practical advice for surviving psychological pressure. Therefore, their art became a form of double-speak, entertainment that satisfied clients while secretly expressing the artist's true emotional lives. Beauty became a language for communicating the uncommunicable, and then there were the children born in this world. Pregnancy was simultaneously a disaster and opportunity for concubines. It meant months of lost income and physical changes that could end careers, but also potential security if the father was wealthy and acknowledged paternity. But most children born in the pleasure quarters faced grim futures. Boys might be sold to other families or sent to monasteries. Girls often followed their mother's paths. raised within the system that would eventually consume them. Therefore, many concubines tried desperately to prevent pregnancy, using traditional methods that were often dangerous or ineffective. Others saw children as their only hope for creating lasting human connections in a world of temporary transactions, and the children who grew up in this environment developed unusual perspectives on human relationships. They understood from early ages that affection could be performed, that beauty was currency, that love and money were often indistinguishable. But some mothers managed to create pockets of genuine nurturing within the commercial environment. They told their children stories, sang them songs, provided whatever stability was possible in inherently unstable circumstances. Therefore, these children often became extraordinarily adaptable and emotionally mature, understanding complex social dynamics that children in normal families never encountered. They learned early to read adult emotions and motivations. And the most tragic cases were daughters who showed early signs of beauty or talent. Mothers faced agonizing choices between protecting their children's innocence and preparing them for the only world they knew how to navigate. But occasionally, a concubine would accumulate enough wealth or influence to send a child away from the pleasure quarters entirely, to relatives in distant provinces, to temples, to merchant families who might provide different opportunities. Therefore, some children of this world escaped to become scholars, artists, merchants, or even government officials. Their early experiences in the pleasure quarters, rather than destroying them, sometimes provided unique insights into human nature that served them well in other careers, and certain times of year transformed the pleasure quarters into theaters of elaborate fantasy. During the Gion festival in summer, the boundaries between performance and reality became completely blurred. The concubines dressed as characters from classical literature, acted out famous love stories, became living embodiments of cultural myths. But these festivals required months of preparation. Women studied the stories they would embody, practiced speeches and gestures, collaborated with customers and musicians to create spectacles that would draw customers from across the country. Therefore, festival season was simultaneously their most creative and most exhausting time. They poured artistic energy into performances that would be remembered for years while working to physical and emotional exhaustion. And the competition between houses was fierce. Each establishment tried to outdo the others with more elaborate costumes, more skilled performances, and more beautiful women. The festivals became showcases where reputations were made or destroyed, but for some concubines, these performances provided rare opportunities to express creativity and talent beyond the usual constraints of client entertainment. They could stretch artistic muscles, collaborate with other artists, create beauty for its own sake rather than purely for commercial purposes. Therefore, many of their most memorable artistic achievements happened during festivals. Poems that became classics, dances that were copied across Japan, songs that outlived the women who created them. And the festivals also created temporary communities that extended beyond the pleasure quarters. Artists, craftspeople, musicians, and writers came together to create these spectacles, forming brief but intense creative partnerships. But when the festivals ended, the concubines returned to their regular routines of individual client entertainment. The collaborative artistic energy dissipated until the next year's celebration, leaving many women nostalgic for those periods of expanded creative possibility. Therefore, the festivals became both highlights and painful reminders of what their lives might have been, like if their talents had been cultivated in different circumstances. And within this world existed a complex educational system. The older, more experienced concubines became teachers to the younger ones. passing down not just practical skills, but philosophical approaches to survival and success. But this wasn't formal education. It was apprenticeship in the arts of psychological manipulation, emotional performance, and physical presentation. The lessons covered everything from how to make difficult clients feel powerful to how to hide signs of illness or distress. Therefore, each generation of concubines learned from the previous one, creating an oral tradition of survival. Techniques that was never written down but was incredibly sophisticated and comprehensive, and the teaching relationships often became the strongest bonds in the pleasure quarters. Older women invested their knowledge and experience in younger ones, creating mentor-student relationships that sometimes lasted for decades. But these relationships could also be exploitative. Some older concubines, facing declining earning potential, used younger women's success to maintain their own status and income. The power dynamics were complex and not always beneficial to the students. Therefore, the smartest young concubines learned to navigate these teaching relationships carefully, extracting useful knowledge while maintaining their independence and protecting their own interests. And some of the most successful concubines eventually became teachers by choice, opening their own schools or establishing themselves as consultants to other pleasure quarters. Their expertise in human psychology and performance became valuable commodities. But even those who escaped to become teachers often found themselves perpetuating the same system that had trapped them. They trained new generations of women for lives of beautiful captivity, because it was the only way they knew how to earn a living. Therefore, the system was self-perpetuating not through force alone, but through the survivors who became its most knowledgeable advocates and administrators. And perhaps their most developed skill was the ability to create and maintain elaborate fantasy narratives. Each concubine had to remember not just the preferences of individual clients, but the entire fictional relationship history she'd constructed with each one. But these weren't simple lies, they were complex, consistent alternative realities where every detail had to align, where contradictions could destroy carefully built illusions. A concubine might maintain dozens of different relationship narratives simultaneously. Therefore, they developed memory techniques that would impress modern cognitive scientists. They created mental filing systems, used associative techniques, practiced recall through elaborate visualization methods, and the most successful ones could maintain these fictional relationships for years, remembering anniversary dates of imaginary first meetings, preferences shared in conversations that never happened, emotional connections that existed only in the client's imagination. But the psychological cost of maintaining multiple false identities was enormous. Many women struggled with dissociation, losing track of their own authentic thoughts and feelings among all the performed personalities. Therefore, some developed elaborate private rituals to maintain connection with their real selves, secret names they never shared, hidden objects that reminded them of their origins, private thoughts they never spoke aloud, and a few managed to find ways to weave elements of their authentic personalities into their professional performances, creating spaces where they could be partially genuine while still serving their clients' fantasies. But for most, the line between performance and reality became increasingly blurred. After years of professional emotional manipulation, many found it difficult to form authentic relationships even with each other. Therefore, the pleasure quarters produced women who were simultaneously masters of human psychology and strangers to their own emotions, experts in love who had never experienced it genuinely, and the financial structures were more complex than most modern businesses. Each concubine was simultaneously entrepreneur, product, employee, and debtor within systems that defied simple categorization. But the successful ones learned to manipulate these economic structures to their advantage. They understood how to create artificial scarcity, how to increase their perceived value, how to build client loyalty that transcended simple physical attraction. Therefore, the most prosperous concubines were essentially running sophisticated marketing operations, building personal brands that could command premium prices in competitive markets, and they developed techniques that modern advertising executives would recognize, creating emotional associations, establishing unique selling propositions, building customer loyalty through personalized service. But they had to do all this while pretending that money wasn't their primary motivation, that they were motivated by genuine affection for their clients rather than economic necessity. Therefore, they became masters of disguised sales techniques, convincing clients to spend enormous sums while making each transaction feel like a gift freely given rather than a service purchased. And the most successful ones eventually began investing their earnings in other ventures, lending money to other concubines, investing in businesses outside the pleasure quarters, building portfolios that might eventually provide independence. But these business activities had to be conducted secretly because acknowledging financial sophistication would undermine their performances of feminine dependency and emotional simplicity. Therefore, some concubines became wealthy businesswomen, while maintaining public personas as delicate flowers who needed male protection and support. And every aspect of their daily routine was designed to transform ordinary women into living fantasies. The morning ritual of applying makeup was like a shamanic ceremony, using cosmetics to literally change their faces into masks of idealized femininity. But these transformations went beyond the physical. They practiced changing their voices, their posture, their gestures, their entire presence to match whatever character they needed to portray for specific clients or occasions. Therefore, getting dressed each day was like preparing for a theatrical performance, with each element of costume and makeup chosen to support a specific role in an ongoing drama. And the most skilled ones could shift between different personas so smoothly that clients might never realize they were seeing performances rather than authentic personalities. But maintaining these multiple identities required enormous mental discipline. They had to remember which personality traits, preferences, and histories belonged to which persona, never allowing the characters to bleed into each other. Therefore, they developed organizational systems for managing their various identities. Mental filing systems that kept each character's traits, relationships, and histories separate and accessible. And some became so skilled at these transformations that they could shift personas multiple times in a single evening, becoming different women for different clients without anyone noticing the changes. But the constant shape-shifting took a psychological toll. Many reported feeling like they were losing track of their original personalities, becoming collections of performed identities rather than coherent individuals. Therefore, the most psychologically resilient ones developed private practices for maintaining connection with their authentic selves, meditation, journaling, or other activities that helped them remember who they were beneath all the performances. And within the pleasure quarters existed rigid social hierarchies based on beauty, talent, and earning potential. At the top were the Oiran, who lived like celebrities, commanding enormous fees and attracting clients from the highest levels of society. But even among the Oiran, there were subtle distinctions, those known for their beauty, others for their artistic skills, some for their intelligence and conversation. Each carved out specific market niches based on their particular combinations of talents. Therefore, success required not just general attractiveness and skill, but the ability to identify and develop a unique personal brand that would distinguish one woman from hundreds of competitors, and the competition was constant and brutal. Women who had been friends could become rivals overnight if they attracted the same clients or competed for the same opportunities. But the hierarchy wasn't entirely static. Younger women could rise by developing skills that older ones lacked, and established favorites could fall if they lost their appeal or made political mistakes. Therefore, every concubine had to balance cooperation and competition, building alliances when beneficial while remaining ready to pursue their own interests when opportunities arose. And those who reached the top levels wielded significant influence, not just within the pleasure quarters, but in broader society. Successful oiran became trendsetters whose fashion choices and cultural preferences influenced women across Japan. But even at the pinnacle of success, they remained prisoners of the system that had elevated them. The higher they rose, the more valuable they became, the less likely they were ever to be released. Therefore, success in this world was paradoxical. The better they became at their profession, the more trapped they became by their own excellence. And they developed elaborate systems of coded communication using flowers, colors, and objects to convey messages that couldn't be spoken aloud. A particular arrangement of cherry blossoms might warn of a dangerous client, while specific combinations of hair ornaments could signal romantic interest or distress. But these codes weren't standardized. Each house, each group of women developed their own systems, creating private languages that allowed for secret communication in public spaces. Therefore, learning these visual languages was essential for survival and success. Women who couldn't read the subtle signals might miss warnings, opportunities, or requests for help, and the codes extended beyond simple communication to become forms of artistic expression. Some women became renowned for their skill in creating flower arrangements or selecting accessories that conveyed complex emotional messages. But clients sometimes learned to interpret these codes as well, leading to elaborate games of hidden, meaning where both parties communicated through symbols while maintaining surface conversations about completely different topics. Therefore, every social interaction in the pleasure quarters operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The apparent conversation, the coded communications, the business negotiations, the emotional performances all happening at once and mastering. These multi-layered communications required intelligence and sophistication that rivaled diplomatic training. The most successful concubines were essentially conducting psychological operations on behalf of themselves and their establishments. But the constant need for coded communication also reflected the lack of freedom these women faced. They could only express their true thoughts and feelings through elaborate subterfuge. Therefore, even their most creative and artistic expressions were shaped by the necessity of hiding their authentic selves from those who controlled their lives. And the men who ran these establishments were sophisticated business people who understood. They were selling fantasies as much as physical experiences. They invested enormous resources in creating environments that supported their clients' illusions about the nature of their relationships with the concubines. But these business owners walked a careful line between providing satisfying fantasies and maintaining control over their valuable human assets. They had to keep clients happy while ensuring that the women remained dependent and trapped. Therefore, the most successful establishments created elaborate theatrical environments where clients could experience temporary escape from their ordinary lives while the women who provided these experiences remained firmly controlled. And the owners employed teams of support staff, servants, musicians, artists, craftspeople, all dedicated to maintaining the illusion that the pleasure quarters were magical realms where ordinary rules didn't apply. But behind the beautiful facades were calculated business operations focused on maximizing profit from human suffering. Every element of beauty and refinement was ultimately designed to extract money from clients and control from the women. Therefore, the pleasure quarters were simultaneously artistic achievements and monuments to human exploitation, places where extraordinary beauty coexisted with profound cruelty. And the most successful owners understood that their long-term profitability depended on maintaining the women's health, skills, and apparent happiness. Damaged goods couldn't command premium prices, but this enlightened self-interest didn't translate into genuine concern for the women's well-being. It simply meant that their exploitation was conducted with more sophisticated techniques. Therefore, even the kindest treatment in this system was ultimately motivated by profit rather than compassion, making genuine human connection between owners and concubines nearly impossible. And the political climate of feudal Japan meant that the pleasure quarters existed at the intersection of official prohibition and unofficial tolerance. Officially, Buddhist teachings condemned such establishments, but practically, they served important economic and social functions. But this ambiguous legal status created constant uncertainty. Political changes, religious reforms, or shifts in public opinion could threaten the entire system overnight. Therefore, the successful establishments cultivated relationships with political and religious leaders, becoming so economically important and socially integrated that they couldn't easily be eliminated. And during times of political instability, the pleasure quarters sometimes became informal intelligence centers where information was gathered and traded along with other commodities. But the women themselves had no political power or protection. They were vulnerable to changes in policy, shifts in social attitudes, or simple bad luck that could destroy their livelihoods without warning. Therefore, the smartest concubines tried to build relationships and accumulate resources that might protect them if the political winds changed and their establishments were closed or reformed, and some became informal advisors to political figures, wielding influence through their relationships with powerful men who valued their intelligence and discretion. But even this political influence was precarious, dependent on maintaining the favor of men who could withdraw their protection at any time for any reason. Therefore, political power for concubines was always borrowed, temporary, and potentially dangerous, a tool that could elevate them or destroy them depending on circumstances beyond their control. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the last clients had gone home and the makeup was finally washed away, the women shared stories that revealed the true cost of their beautiful prisons. I listened to these whispered conversations, tales of girls who simply disappeared one day, of others who found ways to escape that history books never recorded. But these weren't just ghost stories. They were survival manuals disguised as entertainment. Each tale contained coded information about dangerous clients, corrupt officials, or potential escape routes. The women created their own oral history, preserving knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. Therefore, storytelling became another form of resistance, a way to maintain collective memory and share survival strategies without alerting their captors to what they were doing. And some of these stories were about women who had successfully transformed their situations, concubines who became wealthy merchants, others who founded their own establishments, a few who disappeared entirely and presumably found freedom. But even the success stories carried warnings. They spoke of prices paid, sacrifices made, connections severed. Freedom, when it came, often meant solitude and the constant fear of being discovered and dragged back. Therefore, hope and despair lived side by side in these midnight tales, creating complex emotional landscapes where dreams and nightmares were often indistinguishable. And perhaps most tragic of all was watching women learn to forget their own histories. The system demanded that they become new people with new names, new backgrounds, New personalities crafted to appeal to clients rather than reflect their authentic selves. But forgetting wasn't just encouraged, it was necessary for psychological survival. Remembering their families, their childhood dreams. Their original names could make the daily performance of contentment impossible to maintain. Therefore, many women actively worked to erase their pasts, creating elaborate mental barriers between who they had been and who they were required to become. And the most successful ones became masters of selective amnesia, remembering only those aspects of their histories that could be useful in their new roles, while forgetting everything that might cause pain or resistance. But this psychological amputation came with costs. Women who forgot their past sometimes lost their ability to imagine different futures. They became so thoroughly adapted to captivity that freedom, when offered, seemed frightening and impossible. Therefore, the system didn't just trap their bodies, it reshaped their minds, creating women who were psychologically dependent on the very circumstances that oppressed them. And yet, despite all efforts to erase their original selves, something always remained. In unguarded moments, fragments of their authentic personalities would surface, a gesture learned in childhood, a phrase from their original dialect, a moment of genuine laughter that broke through years of careful performance. But these glimpses of authenticity were dangerous. They reminded both the women and their observers that beneath the beautiful performances were real people with real histories that the system was designed to obliterate. Therefore, even the most thoroughly transformed concubines remained haunted by echoes of who they might have been, making their performances of contentment simultaneously more convincing and more heartbreaking. And among the most poignant figures in this world were the elderly concubines who had spent their entire lives in the pleasure quarters. By the time they reached old age, they had become living museums of a society that preferred to pretend they didn't exist. But these elderly women often became the keepers of institutional memory, the ones who remembered the names and stories of girls who had come and gone, who maintained the unwritten histories that official records ignored. Therefore, they served as unofficial historians of their own oppression, preserving details about daily life, individual tragedies, and small victories that would otherwise have been lost forever. And some of these women developed philosophical perspectives on their experiences that were remarkably sophisticated. They understood the economic forces that had shaped their lives, the social hypocrisies that had enabled their exploitation, the psychological mechanisms they had used to survive, but their wisdom came at enormous cost. They had sacrificed their youth, their freedom, their authentic relationships to acquire insights that they could share only with other women trapped in similar circumstances. Therefore, their knowledge was simultaneously precious and useless, profound understanding that could help no one escape the system that had created it. And when these elderly women finally died, they took with them irreplaceable testimony about experiences that society preferred to forget. Their deaths were often unmourned except by the other women who had shared their captivity, but occasionally, one of these elderly survivors would find a way to share her story with the outside world through a sympathetic writer, a reformed client, or a family member who had maintained contact despite social pressure. Therefore, the few historical accounts we have of life in the pleasure quarters often came from these remarkable women who maintained their humanity and their memories despite decades of systematic dehumanization. And sometimes I wondered what might have happened if these women had organized resistance rather than simply trying to survive their individual circumstances. They possessed intelligence, determination, and detailed knowledge of their oppressors' weaknesses, but collective action was nearly impossible in a system designed to pit them against each other in competition for limited resources, and opportunities. Unity would have required sacrificing immediate self-interest for long-term collective benefit. Therefore, resistance remained individual and hidden. Small acts of defiance, secret communications, private preservation of forbidden memories and identities, and the few attempts at organized resistance that did occur were quickly crushed. The women had no legal rights, no political allies, no economic independence that would have allowed them to sustain collective action, but their individual acts of resistance were more significant than they might have realized. Every moment of authentic emotion, every preserved memory, every secret kindness between women was an act of rebellion against a system designed to eliminate their humanity. Therefore, simply remaining human under such circumstances was itself a form of heroism that deserves recognition, even if it couldn't achieve systematic change. And in some ways, their survival and the stories they preserved became forms of historical testimony that eventually contributed to social changes they didn't live to see. But the tragedy remains that so much talent, intelligence, and potential was wasted in a system that treated human beings as decorative objects rather than individuals capable of contributing to society in countless ways. Therefore, their stories serve as reminders not just of historical injustices, but of ongoing human tendencies to reduce people to their economic or aesthetic value rather than recognizing their full humanity. And the pleasure quarters, for all their unique cruelties, reflected broader patterns of how feudal Japanese society treated women as commodities to be traded, controlled, and consumed, rather than as autonomous individuals with their own rights and desires. But the concentration and refinement of these attitudes in the pleasure quarters made visible dynamics that were often hidden in conventional domestic arrangements. The economic nature of relationships, the performance of gender roles, the restriction of women's mobility and choices, all were simply more obvious here. Therefore, studying the lives of concubines reveals not just their specific suffering, but the underlying assumptions about gender, power, and human value that shaped an entire society. And the men who participated in this system weren't necessarily monsters. They were products of a culture that taught them to see such arrangements as normal, even benevolent. Many genuinely believed they were providing opportunities and protection for women who had no other options. But good intentions couldn't transform a fundamentally exploitative system into something beneficial for its victims. The structural inequalities were too profound to be overcome by individual kindness or good intentions. Therefore, the pleasure quarters demonstrate how systems of oppression can persist even when they're populated by people who don't see themselves as oppressors, maintained by cultural assumptions that make exploitation seem natural and inevitable. And the artistic and cultural achievements that emerged from this system, the poetry, music, dance, and visual arts created by and for the concubines, complicate simple moral judgments about the pleasure quarters' legacy, but we can appreciate the beauty these women created while still acknowledging that it emerged from circumstances no human being should have been forced to endure. Their artistry was a triumph of human spirit despite, not because of, their oppression. Therefore, their cultural contributions serve as testimony to human resilience and creativity rather than justification for the system that constrained and exploited them. And when the Meiji Restoration began transforming Japan in the late 19th century, the pleasure quarters found themselves caught between old traditions and new social movements that questioned their existence. The women who had spent their lives in this system faced an uncertain future as society debated their fate. But social change moved slowly, and many of the fundamental patterns I had observed continued well into the modern era. The specific forms evolved, but the underlying dynamics of commodifying women's beauty and sexuality persisted in new configurations. Therefore, the abolition of the official pleasure quarters didn't immediately liberate the women who had lived in them. Many found themselves in equally restricted circumstances, just with different names and legal structures. And some of the women who had survived the old system became advocates for others still trapped in similar situations. They used their hard-won understanding of exploitation to identify and resist its newer forms. But others remained so psychologically shaped by their experiences that they couldn't adapt to lives with greater freedom and responsibility. The skills that had helped them survive captivity weren't necessarily useful for navigating autonomous existence. Therefore, liberation was a complex and often painful process that required not just legal changes, but psychological and social transformations that took generations to accomplish. And even today, echoes of these historical patterns can be seen in contemporary discussions about gender, sexuality, economic inequality, and human rights. The specific circumstances change, but the underlying human tendencies toward exploitation and commodification remain relevant challenges. But the stories of these women also provide inspiration for contemporary efforts to recognize and resist systems that reduce human beings to their economic or aesthetic value rather than honoring their full humanity. Therefore, remembering their experiences serves both as historical testimony and as guidance for ongoing struggles to create societies that value human dignity above profit and control. That I'm the historian. I have seen much, and I will see more. Perhaps, one day, I shall tell you again. The women of the pleasure quarters are long gone now, but their shadows still dance in the corners of any society that forgets people can be more than beautiful objects to be bought and sold. In their memory, we might learn to see each other more clearly.